4 of Scotland's most infamous murders were committed within 1 square mile of each other.
This is such a tragic story from beginning to end.
A fascinating story because it brings together all the great elements of murder, mystery, suspense.
Perhaps one of the earliest serial killers to be tried in the Scottish courts.
The motives are the same most often with murders, which are lust, greed, money, power. Pritchard was no different.
Subsequent writings have suggested strongly that Elizabeth was in fact Pritchard's first victim.
I think away in the background there must have been this compulsion in the man to be ruthless with poisons. Who would be next?
It rocks the confidence that the public has in a profession that's so respected and trusted, but who ultimately have access to both the knowledge and the chemicals that can bring about the death of others.
He was a liar, he was a lech, he was a cruel person, he was callous, and he cared not a jot for anybody else, not his wife, not his mother-in-law, not his children. He could have become the 19th century Shipman.
On the 28th of July 1865, massive crowds gathered in the centre of Glasgow to witness the last public execution in Britain. The condemned man was a doctor, found guilty of murdering his wife and mother-in-law. The ghoulish tale of Edward Pritchard continues to fascinate. Throughout history, physicians who kill are not uncommon.
I think there's both a fascination and also a fear that individuals in whom the public place that level of trust, as we do with doctors, have such an opportunity, should they so decide, to not live up to the oath they have taken, but instead extinguish life.
Edward Pritchard was convicted of 2 murders, but it's likely he committed at least 1 more. Although the crimes took place in Scotland, the killer was born in England.
If Dr. Pritchard had behaved himself, he had everything going for him.
Edward Pritchard was born in 1825 into a naval family, and there's a long line of involvement in the Navy, his father and his brother. And it's undoubtedly for that reason that Edward was sent to be an apprentice to surgeons in Plymouth. And that's where his medical training began.
That was a fantastic qualification to have, but I don't think he got it on honest grounds.
Pritchard also claimed to have attended King's College London, but no record of this has ever been traced.
His qualifications were uncertain. Certainly one of his medicine degrees was through the post, and it was from a university in Germany, and there was no teaching involved in it.
After that, he went off sailing the high seas. He was away up in the Scandinavian waters, and he sailed around Egypt and the Med.
The flamboyant naval surgeon cut a striking figure.
Dr. Pritchard was a tall, stoutish, well-made man. He had a big, huge, big beard. This was his main feature. And he had quite a big forehead, and a lot of people describe him as being slightly effeminate.
His hair was thinning on top, but being quite a vain man, it would appear, he combed his hair over, what's now known as a comb-over.
So that, allied to his enormous bulk, his frame, his look was fairly unforgettable.
Pritchard rose through the ranks and served on the HMS Victory during its final days at sea. 5 years after joining the Navy and while on leave, he met a young Scottish woman.
In 1850, Edward and other officers were invited to a ball in Portsmouth, and it was there that he met Mary Jane Taylor. And it's said that it was love at first sight on both parts, and they married later that year in the autumn of 1850. Mary Jane was from Edinburgh. Her father was a very well-off silk merchant.
So I suppose, knowing what he was like later on, he saw the pound signs and he thought, I'll go for this one.
When he met Mary Jane, he was embraced by her family, who thought he was a marvellous character, and they approved him of marriage. They were married, and he went back to sea for a while, and then he returned to shore.
Pritchard struggled financially with setting up a general practice of his own.
He was always skint, Dr. Pritchard, and he went to work in the Yorkshire area as a general practitioner. And in these days, you had to buy your way into a practice. He had no money. But Mary Jane's mum was so taken on by Dr. Pritchard, she bought him into the practice.
The Pritchards started a family, but this was no devoted husband.
During his time in Yorkshire, Edward quickly gathered a reputation for being both a womaniser and also a man who incurred high levels of debt. And indeed, that womanising with both married and unmarried patients caused considerable difficulty for the family. Now, in fact, it was his wife that first left Yorkshire and returned to her parents in Edinburgh due to ill health, and she took the children with her. Edward then sold his medical practice for £400, a substantial sum, in 1860.
By the summer of that year, the Pritchards had moved to Glasgow. The local medical fraternity was wary of him, but he was determined to make his mark.
Edward was a man who was very full of himself and very keen to establish both a reputation and a connection with the existing physicians in Glasgow. However, they were not a welcoming audience.
When he came to Glasgow and he started mixing amongst real doctors, they were always a bit suspicious of him. And, you know, it wasn't just because he was English, but he never, ever got on with the Glasgow set.
The Pritchards rented a property in an affluent part of town.
Berkeley Terrace was a particularly good address in those days in Glasgow. It was where he wanted to be. It was where the family needed to be because of space considerations. And they set up home there. He set up a practice which was doing rather well. In the same way as Pritchard had lost out in his effort to ingratiate himself with the medical community, his own marriage by this time was beginning to show signs that the veneer was cracking.
One of the members of staff of the household was Elizabeth McGurn. Pritchard, Dr. Pritchard, began a relationship with Elizabeth. And of course, this wasn't out of character for him. He was continuing to womanise patients, staff, as well as obviously still having his wife.
But he continued to fight his way up the career ladder.
He'd written lots of papers on cancer and gout. And he was also appointed director of the Athenaeum. Another fantastic achievement, because that was a big feather in his cap.
His requirement for attention and to have a public persona, a public platform, reflects a great vanity.
In the days before advertising, Pritchard decided that self-publicity was the best form to project himself as he tried to establish his medical practices, and he had pictures taken of himself and decided that as he walked through the town, he would hand these out to people who he deemed fit, possibly who he thought maybe prospective patients and clients, and who could do something for him.
The doctor hosted many private lectures, regaling his audiences with tales of his travels overseas.
He claimed to have hunted eagles in Arabia, lions in North America. He claimed that his brother was the Governor-General of Ceylon, and he claimed that a walking stick he used had been presented to him by Garibaldi, the famous Italian nationalist, and there was an inscription on the walking stick which said presented to Edward Pritchard by his friend General Garibaldi.
And to this day, the general consensus is that Pritchard neither met nor knew nor corresponded with Garibaldi at any time in his life.
He had acquired a lot of information through his travels, but he gilded the lily somewhat.
On the night of the 5th of May 1863, things took a sinister twist. Pritchard had continued his affair with the servant Elizabeth McGurn, who occupied an attic bedroom in Berkeley Terrace.
That night, Mrs. Pritchard and the other maid who was in the house had gone out for the night, and he was around the house till he went out later on, and he didn't come in till about 11, 12 o'clock. And he said he noticed the light up in Elizabeth's bedroom, and the next thing was two of his boys came running down the stairs shouting, "Papa, Papa," and the place was on fire.
Shortly after the fire commenced, local police officers attended the house, rang the doorbell, and Dr. Pritchard answered the door fully clothed. This was of some surprise because Dr. Pritchard claimed that he had been in bed, had been woken by smoke, had run to the bedroom on the same level as his own to find his two sons who were screaming due to having been woken also by the fire. He accompanied them to the hallway that led to the front door, and then by his account went upstairs to the attic level of the house where Elizabeth McGurn's bedroom was.
The suggestion was that perhaps a girl had been reading in bed and that the curtains had caught on the jet gas in the room. But thereafter, there was no book found.
By this time, Elizabeth McGurn's body was a charred mess, and her face was completely burnt. One of her arms was completely burnt off. And because she was wearing stockings in bed and blankets covering the stockings, apart from her toes, her lower limbs were preserved and a bit of her torso.
The circumstances surrounding the death of the young servant girl were very suspicious. She was found in a position where she apparently made no struggle. Even though she may have been affected by smoke, there was no effort to try and get herself out of the room.
Normally in a fire like this, there'd be a lot of muscle contracting and signs of alarm, whereas the girl appeared quite peaceful and none of these contractures were evident. And so that was suspicious, and people were wondering if maybe she was dead before the fire. Did he go up there and murder her? Or was she given some soporific to make sure that she didn't get wakened when the fire started?
The fire, he claimed, was accidental. And of course it took the life of Elizabeth McGurn.
Despite the suspicious circumstances, the law enforcement agencies did nothing at the time. Interestingly, it was only later on that the people began to consider that there may have been foul play at this time. But people started to question latterly only, had Pritchard got away with murder at this time?
Despite Elizabeth McGurn's horrific death in the fire, while his own children were in the house, Pritchard wasted no time in finding new premises. And his wife's family continued to bail him out financially.
After the fire, the family moved a couple of times and they ended up in Sauchiehall Street.
His mother-in-law, Mrs. Taylor, had given him £500 towards the purchase, and he borrowed £1,600. His position was that this was a gift from Mrs. Taylor. However, it's understood that her position was it was a loan.
In addition, they had to replace Elizabeth McGurn. And again, Pritchard and his wandering eye came to the fore.
Poor, unsuspecting Mary MacLeod came to work for the Pritchards, and she was only 15. She was an island girl, came from Islay, and very soon after she arrived, Dr. Pritchard started to chat her up and seduced her.
By the summer and autumn of 1864, Mrs. Pritchard had already caught Dr. Pritchard and Mary in an embrace in one of the bedrooms in the house. Unknown to her, it would seem, Mary was in fact pregnant by that time. When Mary told Pritchard she was carrying his child, he said he would sort it out.
Pritchard's medical knowledge seems to have allowed him to carry out a termination.
We don't know how this was carried out. They had many fancy things at that time, slippery elm bark, but she apparently came through the abortion all right. Nobody knew anything about it.
Meanwhile, Mary Jane Pritchard seems to have been remarkably tolerant of her husband's errant ways.
Mary offered to leave, but Mrs. Pritchard was fond of Mary, and she said, no, you mustn't leave.
She was prepared to put up with her husband's ways, but she didn't want the girl disadvantaged in any way, which was more than generous of her, but it was also really to keep the image of a happy, contented family life in the public domain. And
of course, prior to the Married Women's Property Act, she had no property of her own. Although the house would have been purchased, it would have been in his name. She'd have relied on him economically to support her.
Not only was this her husband, but he was her general practitioner. He took care of all things to do with the household and treating them, and she had nobody else to turn to.
Perhaps it was no coincidence that shortly after that, Mrs. Pritchard began to take ill.
Chemist records show that on the 16th of November 1864, Pritchard bought an ounce of tartarized antimony. Its medicinal use dates back to the ancient Greeks, but the metallic element is highly toxic in itself.
In October 1864, Mary Jane began to suffer the beginnings of a number of bouts of illness. Illness was of a gastric nature and was generally triggered by her either eating or drinking a substance.
She had nausea, she had aches, she had pain, she had tiredness, she had headaches. She suffered depression and eventually she was bedridden for a while.
Pritchard insisted that his wife was suffering from gastric fever. A number of other doctors also attended to Mary Jane.
People trusted doctors in these days, still trust doctors today, but in these days, anything the doctor said, you did.
Throughout her illness, Mrs. Pritchard was prescribed many odd remedies.
Despite the fact that some of the elite of Glasgow's medical school were on hand, their prescriptions were somewhat bizarre. In an effort to try and provide remedies, she was offered everything from champagne and ice, mustard poultices, chloroform and even brandy, but nobody actually got to the bottom of the problem.
To the outside world, the Pritchards were respectable gentry, but the doctor was leading a double life. Over the course of November 1864, he made at least 2 further purchases of antimony and the vegetable substance aconite.
Aconite is still used homeopathically. Aconite is a fantastic homeopathic remedy to use in the situation of a big fright, like somebody just involved in a car accident and they're really traumatized. Aconite immediately calms them down. But that is aconite diluted down 1,000 times. Whereas you imagine giving a grain of that same stuff in somebody's food.
The Pritchards had 5 children and took in medical students as lodgers. It seems incredible that no one challenged the doctor about his inability to treat his wife.
She didn't catch on to anything amiss herself for quite a while, although she continued to have vomiting and diarrhea, a lot of both. And then at one stage, on the suggestion of her brother, she decided to go to Edinburgh for a wee break. And strangely enough, when she went to Edinburgh to stay at Grange in Lauder Drive with her mother and father, she improved drastically. All this sickness stopped.
And indeed, when Mary Jane and the oldest daughter returned to Glasgow for Christmas, the family enjoyed a very happy Christmas, and Mary Jane was enjoying some very good health.
Was this because she had been separated from her husband for a spell? Pritchard laid on a lavish festive celebration for the whole family. What they didn't know was that he had recently bought an ounce of Fleming's tincture of aconite, 6 times stronger than the previous purchase.
Whilst in modern day terms, the free and regular purchase of poisons and very powerful poisons sounds extremely strange to us. In 1865, it wasn't an unusual purchase necessarily to be made by anyone, and in particular not by a doctor. And of course, any pharmacist would, with confidence, give such a substance to a doctor in the belief that it be being used to appropriately treat a patient.
New Year came, and that was when she started to get really ill again. Obviously, Dr. Pritchard had started really giving her regular amounts, bit by bit. He was cunning enough not to poison her completely with one big dose of something, which would have been found, but he chose to give her a little of the antimony throughout all these weeks. And the poor soul got so weak that her brother had said to her, I think we should get your mother through to help again and look after you because you really need a nurse.
In early February 1865, Mary Jane suffered a serious attack of illness and was bedridden again. Her mother, Jane Taylor, travelled through to Glasgow to look after her.
She was a feisty, capable 70-year-old woman who very quickly took on the role of running the Pritchard household and was discharging her duties very efficiently.
But as was common at the time, the elderly Mrs. Taylor was a regular user of opium. She consumed it in liquid form bought over the counter. It was marketed as Batley's sedative solution.
Mrs. Taylor had begun to take the product to help relieve neuralgia headaches that she suffered from. But of course the nature of the potion was that she very quickly became addicted and required to take increasing amounts of the sedative solution to satisfy her appetite for it.
It was taken by people who could afford it. I noticed that she paid 8 shillings and 6pence for one of the bottles to be filled. That was a lot of money at that time. And so she was dabbling in this Batley solution, and it helped her with her headaches and kept her spirits up.
Edward assisted his mother-in-law in getting hold of the sedative solution. He suggested that she use the same bottle, have it filled at the chemist's on Suggy Hall Street that he attended, and that he would assist her with that and it would cost less money. This, of course, gave Edward the opportunity to add an additional solution to the sedative.
And he started to put aconite in. The chemists later on definitely identified this in her medication. And so Mrs. Taylor was saying to Mrs. Pritchard, I think I've got the same thing as you. Dr. Pritchard had called it gastric flu the whole time.
In addition, she started to feel unwell as well, some of the same symptoms as her daughter. Various doctors were brought in to examine both women. Nobody came up with any particular remedy or any solution. One doctor even prescribed champagne and ice as a possible curative. But latterly, at the very end, a neighbour, Dr. James Patterson, was brought in to examine Mrs. Taylor to try and ascertain what was wrong with her.
On the 13th of February, Mary Jane said she felt well enough to eat some tapioca pudding. One of the children was sent out to buy some. The raw tapioca was left in the hall for a time before servant Mary MacLeod took it through to the kitchen and cooked it.
It was left outside Dr. Pritchard's consulting room and indeed on the cabinet where the poison was kept. It lay there for some time, and whilst no one saw anyone tamper with it, it would appear that something happened because the tapioca was taken upstairs.
He said, don't put sugar in it because Mrs. Pritchard likes to sweeten it herself. She knows how much sugar to put in. So he had gone out and got a lump of sugar, and he had actually gone via the consulting room into the dining room to get this. So obviously picked up a dod of antimony as well and shoved it into the tapioca.
But by that time, Mrs. Pritchard had gone off the notion of having it, and instead it was eaten by her mother, Mrs. Taylor, who very quickly became very ill.
By now, it was clear that illness only flared up whenever the woman had something to eat or drink. The Pritchards' cook, Catherine Latimer, had been with the family for some time.
Pritchard decided to dispense with the services of Mrs. Latimer, ostensibly because she was supposed to have been giving away food. But the real reason was probably because of the fact that Pritchard was using Mrs. Latimer's food to poison his wife.
Given that the family did have staff to both cook and wait on them, an obvious question to ask is, well, how did the poison get into the food or drink substances? And it would appear that Edward's performance as the devoted husband who would deliver food and drinks to his wife was in fact the guise to give him the opportunity to introduce additional substances to everything that his wife ate or drank. On 24th of February, Mary MacLeod went up to check on Mrs. Taylor, who was confined to her daughter's bedroom. On the third occasion, she found her unconscious in a chair and was quite alarmed. Mrs. Pritchard was pleading with her husband to assist her mother, and his rather callous response was that he could do nothing for a dead woman, even though by that point in time she was not yet dead.
They had called Dr. Patterson in to see her, and when they sent Mary MacLeod later on to get him back, he refused to come because he thought he couldn't do anything for her. And then he got another message to say that Mrs. Taylor had died, not to bother coming.
Pritchard recorded in his diary how his mother-in-law's features were so finely drawn it would be impossible to determine when life may be said to have departed.
Dr. Pritchard completed Mrs. Taylor's death certificate and gave the cause of death as paralysis and apoplexy. Subsequent commentators have pointed out that this is nonsensical, as apoplexy would precede paralysis and not so would be the primary rather than the secondary cause of death.
Dr. Patterson was the last doctor to see Mrs. Taylor before she died, but he decided that he didn't want to sign the death certificate.
He wasn't going to put his name against gastric flu, and apoplexy was another name bandied about. And so he refused to give the death certificate.
And instead returned it to the registrar with a note. And in that note he expressed concern about the death of Mrs. Taylor. The registrar took no action on that note and instead threw it in the bin.
6 days after the death of his mother-in-law, Pritchard met Dr. Patterson in the street. He asked him to continue caring for his wife, who was by now too ill to attend her mother's funeral with him.
He had brought in the finest of medical consultants from the university, from neighbours. The elite of the medical community had looked at his wife and were unable to say what was wrong with him. Obviously trying to cover his tracks, trying to make sure that nobody realised that he was poisoning his wife, at the same time presenting this hypocritical face to the family who thought so highly of him.
On the 7th of March, Pritchard presented Mary MacLeod with a brooch. By her later account, their affair had continued.
On the 9th of March, he wrote to his father-in-law, Mr. Taylor, in Edinburgh, and reported that his wife was suffering quite serious ill health and indeed was too weak to write to her father. This is followed by various documented dates where Pritchard was continuing to buy poison from the chemists in Sauchiehall Street.
The other incident was egg flip that Dr. Pritchard had wanted his wife to have, and he told Mary MacLeod to mix it really thoroughly so it was nice and smooth, otherwise that she wouldn't take it. And so he said, when you're finished, just leave it in the hall and I'll take it up to her. So she took the egg flip and she was pretty sick after it. So obviously that had been tampered with as well.
Despite the staff members, on a number of reported occasions, having tasted either food or drink that had been laced with poison, no real suspicion seems to have arisen in their minds that something untoward was happening to their mistress. Or if it was, if such a concern did arise, they clearly did not feel able to express that, which may reflect the power imbalance between a middle-class family such as the Pritchards and those who were in service to them.
At around 8 p.m. on the 17th of March, Dr. Patterson was called to the house again. Mary Jane was hallucinating and in great distress.
There was another prescription given for a mixture of chlorodyne, ipecacuanha, which is still used today as an antiemetic, and morphine, and cinnamon water. What a concoction.
It isn't a great surprise, in fact, that Dr. Patterson found her in a raving state. Indeed, he himself had prescribed on an earlier occasion a combination of chloroform, champagne and ice.
She thought she could feel her mother, and she was trying to make her mother comfortable in the bed beside her. And Dr. Pritchard himself was putting on this big show of sympathy and saying to his wife, "Oh, Minnie, don't leave me, don't leave me." And what a two-faced character he was.
During that time, numerous poultices were applied to Mrs. Pritchard, And on the final occasion, when Mary entered the room with the third poultice and Mr. Pritchard raised his wife's nightdress to have the poultice placed, Mary MacLeod said to him, "There is no point, for she is already dead."
At that time, Pritchard was in the room and he uttered the various words, very melodramatic, and he said, come back, Mary Jane, do not leave your dear Edward."
He has a dramatic outburst and has a very convincing demonstration of grief, despite the fact, of course, that as a doctor, he's been lying next to his wife as she's taken her last breath of life. And he behaves both as someone who's surprised and bereft and really behaves slightly hysterically.
It was Dr. Patterson's last chance to speak up. He chose not to.
He could have gone earlier to the police, he could have gone to the authorities, but he failed to do so.
Despite his reluctance to come forward in person, it seems likely that Dr. Patterson was in the end moved to act and alert the authorities to Pritchard's crimes.
An anonymous letter had been sent to the Procurator Fiscal, which stated concern that his mother-in-law had died only 2 weeks previously and now his wife lay dead, and that both of those deaths were in suspicious circumstances.
The letter was enough to trigger a police investigation. Meanwhile, the doctor travelled to Edinburgh, where his wife's body was laid out in her father's house.
The coffin was in the house, the lid was screwed down, and Pritchard decided that he wanted to see his wife one last time. This horrified some of the mourners who were in the room at the time, but they decided to take the lid off, and at this point he bent down and kissed his wife on the lips several times, and he also wept, and this earned him the nickname the human crocodile, after the myth that crocodiles shed tears when they eat their human victims.
He managed to recover from his grief quite promptly, though. In his return train journey, he was able to engage in conversation with a stranger and indeed supply that stranger with one of his photographic cards that he was continuing to distribute to the public.
But it was all over for the man the press now referred to as the poisoning philanderer. When the Edinburgh-Glasgow train pulled into the station, Pritchard was arrested on suspicion of murder.
The bodies of the two women were exhumed, post-mortems were carried out, and poison was found to be present in both.
Following his arrest, Pritchard was taken to Calton Jail in Edinburgh. He was to stand trial on an indictment of murdering both women.
His defence team at the opening of the trial made a motion for the trial on the two charges to be separated. This was because it was a circumstantial case against Dr. Pritchard. The Crown could not identify either the date or the means by which the poison was introduced to the two women. And therefore, for the Crown case, it was important to show a pattern of behaviour by Pritchard. And it was for exactly that same reason that the defence wished the trials to be separated. The judges did not allow the trials to be separated and the trial commenced.
The high-profile trial of a medical practitioner accused of the murders of his wife and mother-in-law by poisoning caused a sensation that spread far beyond the city where the crimes had been committed.
There were special provisions made in court. The press area was extended dramatically and admission to the public galleries was by ticket only. Massive verbatim reports were carried everywhere throughout the country and there was a huge amount of public interest in it. Pritchard decided that he would plead not guilty despite the overbearing weight of forensic results which showed the poisoning in the women.
The evidence was very strong against him after the appearances of both bodies looked good. You know, on external appearance, nobody would have known they had had such traumatic deaths. But the post-mortem evidence was totally conclusive. Now, antimony, being a chemical substance, would get deposited here and there, but very different for aconite, because you can't find these vegetable poisons in a person long after death. They're gone, but they've done their damage. But the antimony was very much around in all of these organs, particularly the liver.
But this was all circumstantial evidence, as the leading defence counsel tried to uphold.
In a circumstantial case, the role of the defence is to cast a doubt in the mind of the jury. And where you have an unspecific indictment in terms of dates and times, that doubt is cast by not saying the accused was in a place at a certain time, but instead the doubt is cast by suggesting that the accused is of good character and not the type of person who would commit murders of this sort.
At the end, when the jury went out, they only took 55 minutes for a unanimous verdict of guilt.
Pritchard was a consummate actor, apart from a medical man, and his life up until this point had been a series of one-act dramas. He ended the trial with a theatrical bow in the direction of the court to signify the trial had finished, and he knew the game was now up.
And what of Mary MacLeod? Although she never faced a charge, odd suspicions remained.
The defence themselves wanted to suggest that Mary may in some way be involved, that she in fact was the person whose job it was to deliver food and drink, and she may have been the person who could introduce those fatal substances to food and drink. However, quite clearly, the jury were not convinced by that approach.
The blame rested squarely with the doctor. The case of Edward Pritchard is one of the 4 notorious Scottish murders that took place within 1 square mile of Glasgow. Committed between 1857 and 1908, the stories continue to court curiosity. But what sets the case of Edward Pritchard aside from the rest is his confession.
After his trial, he saw several ministers of the church. There were 3 or 4 involved, and he would dismiss one and take up with another. He wrote 4 confessions, all full of lies. One wouldn't know what the truthful one was. In the end, he more or less admitted to total guilt in his final confession and said he made his peace with God. But he won't be forgotten in the Glasgow area and in medical circles.
On the day of Edward Pritchard's hanging, Glasgow effectively came to a standstill.
Pritchard's was the last public execution in Scotland, and clearly the public appetite to watch the gruesome event of a person being hung was enormous, as a crowd of between 80 and 100,000 people were drawn.
The masses turned out. The people who turned out were from all walks of life, some of the lowest of society, and much drink had been taken in the lead up to the hanging, and there were numerous counts of public drunkenness as they waited for the appointed 8 a.m. hanging time.
The hangman was William Calcraft, who in his time as an executioner saw more than 400 criminals condemned to death. He was reputed to have the longest career and the shortest rope.
When the execution was staged, there was no curtain placed below the gallows, so that when the bolt was slid, Pritchard was cast into oblivion and his entire body could be seen jerking in front of the crowd.
And in all the scandal of the trial, perhaps Pritchard's first Glasgow victim was overlooked.
He died for 2 murders, but perhaps he was guilty of 3 because the death of the serving girl, Elizabeth McGurn, was never adequately explained, and had it been properly examined, it may well have been that Pritchard would have gone down as not just a double murderer, but as a serial killer.